3 minutes out from the Saul relay, Vesherin ordered her helmsman to bleed the last of the approach margin and take the drop hot. "Formal notice runs 40 hours, said Orrin, her chief of intelligence, not for the first time. "If we arrive before the Directorate clears us through their own protocol, Governor Draeth will read it as an insult. She'll leave us waiting at the gate while she finishes whatever she's doing on the ground." "She is already finishing it." Vesherin did not look up from the report scrolling across the console. A single page from a Sethari trade auditor stationed at a grain exchange 3 sectors core ward, forwarded that morning with a priority flag she had not seen used in 4 years. Second Tithe requisition orders, sector-wide. A depot on the Bramwell line flagged for collective remediation. A named list of workers to be made an example of, headed by a man whose name she had spent 9 years chasing through unregistered manifests and dead ends. Eli Rourke. "Then we arrive hot," she said, "and I will apologize to the governor in person at whatever length she requires after." Orrin did not argue further. In 9 years he had learned there were exactly 2 subjects on which the Queen of the Sethari conquered took no counsel: the debt registry, and this name specifically. He keyed the burn instead, and the kindred's vow shed reaction mass at a rate her engineers would complain about for a week, and Saul grew from a point of light to a disk to a furnace in under 4 minutes. Eli Rourke heard the trucks before he saw them. A low diesel cousin wine that had no business existing on a world the Directorate supposedly ran on clean Imperial drives, because the trucks the Directorate actually sent to collect grain from a backwater depot like Bramwell were 40 years old and held together with parts nobody had bothered to update in 20 of them. He counted 4 from the loading dock, 3 more than a routine collection run. Eli, Seth Halloran, who ran the number 2 scale house, came down the gantry stairs 2 at a time. "That's not the regular crew, that's Directorate green full column." "I can see the trucks, Seth." "I mean troopers. 30, maybe more, riding the flatbeds like they're expecting trouble." Seth's voice had the particular flatness of a man keeping himself from shaking. "And there's a requisition officer's pennant on the lead cab. Second Tithe. It's real. They're not here to collect, Eli, they're here to seize." Eli set down the grain moisture probe he'd been carrying and looked out across the yard at Bramwell Depot. 700 people's worth of a town built around one long steel shed, and 40 years of rail spur. Every bushel of this season's harvest already stacked and counted and waiting for a normal collection that would leave them enough to eat through the winter. The second Tithe order, if it was real, meant the number the Directorate expected out of Bramwell had just doubled. 18,000 bushels instead of 9. The depot didn't have 18,000 bushels. Nobody's depot did. The Frontier War Corps had been eating grain by the fleet load for 2 years, and somebody in the Corvane throne had finally done the arithmetic on where the shortfall would land, and the answer, apparently, was here. Tobias Ferry, the depot master, came out of the grain office wiping his hands on a rag he didn't need, the particular tell he'd had for 30 years of counting a number in his head and not liking what it added up to. 9,000 was already tight this season, he said low, to no one in particular. Drought took the North Field down 11%. We don't have 18,000 bushels sitting in that shed, Eli. We don't have 16. If they take what the order says, this town eats stored root and rationed protein through March, and that's if nobody gets sick. They know that, Eli said. That's the point of an example. It's not supposed to be survivable. It's supposed to be visible. Seth's jaw worked. Then we refuse the count. And they shoot whoever's standing closest to the scale when they do it, and take the grain anyway, and Bramwell's still short in March, except now it's short a person too. Eli had learned that arithmetic 9 years ago on his knees, and had never once seen a version of it that came out differently. We don't refuse. We get through today's count clean. We keep our heads down, and we figure out March in March. Easy for you to say your name's not the one there. Seth stopped himself before he finished it, but it hung there anyway, because everyone at Bramwell who'd been here more than a decade knew exactly whose name carried a 9-year-old flag on the Directorate's books, and Eli had stopped flinching at the reminder around year 6. "Get Milo," Eli said. "Get him inside, keep him with you at the number 2 house, don't let him come looking for me." "Eli." "Go, Seth." The truck stopped in a line along the depot's main apron, and men in Directorate green stepped down off the flatbeds in a manner that told Eli everything about how this was going to go before a single word was spoken. They didn't fan out to search. They didn't call for the depot master. They walked in a straight column toward the grain office with a woman at the front who wore an administrator's collar instead of a trooper's rig, and behind her, riding low and quiet on his own single-seat runner, came the man Eli had hoped never to see standing in Bramwell's yard again. Warden Corvik Lassen, 9 years older than the last time Eli had looked at his face, and looking, if anything, more satisfied with himself. The woman in the administrator's collar stopped in the center of the apron and unrolled a data slate, and her voice carried the particular projection of someone who had given this speech at 3 other depots already that week, and expected to give it at 3 more before it was over. By order of Governor Ilsa Draeth, Tithe Directorate, Bramwell Sector, this depot's harvest is hereby placed under second tithe requisition, effective this hour. All grain currently stored on site, including reserve stock designated for local consumption, is now Directorate property. Depot personnel will assemble at the loading apron for a compliance roll. She lowered the slate a fraction. Bramwell has a prior structural risk designation on file from a shrinkage incident 9 years ago. Under Directorate policy, sites with unresolved risk designations receive a compliance example alongside the requisition. Personnel named on today's roll will be held for remediation review. Eli's stomach dropped the way it had dropped exactly once before in his life, on a night 9 years gone that he still measured every hard thing since against. He knew, before she read the first name off the slate, that his was going to be on it. 9 years earlier, the winter had been the kind that made itself known before the first frost, a dry autumn, a thin harvest, and a Directorate quota that hadn't moved an inch to account for either. Eli Rourke was 18 that year, working the night rotation at Bramwell's number 1 scale house, because the night rotation paid a half-ration bonus, and his grandmother's lungs had started failing in a way that meant somebody needed to be buying medicine that wasn't on the depot's approved list. His father had been gone 4 years by then. Labor debt levy, Corward, a work order with no return clause attached to it, and a payment schedule Eli had inherited along with the debt itself, because that was how Directorate levies worked. You didn't just lose the person, you kept paying for having lost them. What Eli had left of his father fit in a tin box under his cot, a service chit nobody had ever redeemed, a photograph gone soft at the corners, and 11 small carved birds, whittled from scrap fence-post oak during the handful of quiet evenings his father had allowed himself in a life otherwise consumed by keeping a family fed on an occupied world's rations. His father had been good with a knife and bad at everything the Directorate valued, which was, Eli had come to understand, most of why he was gone. The night the transport stopped on the Bramwell spur wasn't supposed to be remarkable. Prisoner and tribute cargo ran through on the spur twice a month, unlisted on any schedule Eli was allowed to see, coupled onto the tail of a supply train, and shunted onto the siding to wait out a signal delay before continuing on toward the deep labor colonies 3 jumps out. Eli had seen enough of those cars pass through in 4 years of night work to have stopped looking at them. He looked at this one because it was screaming. Not screaming the way a mechanical fault screamed, a high, thin, ragged sound underneath the coupling yard noise, coming from a transport car with ventilation slats too narrow to see through, and a Directorate manifest seal that listed the contents as unregistered tribute, live, SETHAR vein pacification, QTY 14. Eli had heard about the pacification of Sethari the way everyone on Bramwell had heard about it, as a line in a Directorate bulletin, 3 months old by the time it reached a backwater depot like this one, announcing that a rebellious tribute world corward had been brought into full compliance and that select surviving population elements were being processed for redistribution. He hadn't thought about it since. Nobody on Bramwell had reason to think about a pacification on a world none of them had ever heard of before the bulletin ran. He thought about it now, standing in the yard at 2 in the morning with his breath fogging and that thin, ragged sound coming through a slatted transport car 14 meters away, quantity 14, live. He didn't have clearance to open a sealed tribute car. He didn't have clearance to approach one. What he had was a service key that opened the ventilation access panel on any car parked on Bramwell rolling stock, because that was a maintenance function his scale house rotation covered, and a decision that took him about 4 seconds to make, and that he would spend the rest of his life understanding he had never actually decided. His hands were already moving before the thought finished forming. The panel came open on a smell that hit him like a wall, cold iron, unwashed bodies, and underneath it, unmistakably, the smell of people who had not eaten properly in longer than was survivable. His suit lamp found them in pieces, huddled shapes packed into a space built to move freight, not children, feathered down matted flat with cold sweat along thin shoulders, eyes that caught the light and didn't blink, because blinking cost more than they could spare. 14 of them. The oldest maybe 10 years old by whatever the Sethari equivalent worked out to. She was on her feet before any of the others, placed herself between Eli's lamp and the rest of the huddle with both hands out and empty, and said something in a language Eli didn't know a single word of, in a voice that had no fear in it at all, only a flat, exhausted readiness to fight him for whatever came next. Eli had a ration bar in his coat pocket, half a shift's worth, the other half already eaten hours ago. He held it out on an open palm the way you'd offer something to an animal you didn't want to spook, and said the only thing he could think to say, which was his own name. Eli. The girl looked at the ration bar for 3 full seconds before she looked at his face. Then she took it out of his hand, broke it into 14 pieces with a precision that told him exactly how many times she had already had to do this exact division under worse conditions, and passed a piece to every child behind her before she ate her own. She said something back to him, 2 syllables, sharp and clipped, and it took him 3 more nights before he understood it was her name. Guess. The transport sat on the Bramwell siding for 6 weeks. Eli learned later, from a maintenance log he wasn't supposed to have access to, that the delay was a corward routing failure that had nothing to do with Bramwell at all. Some administrative snarl 3 systems over that left dozens of tribute transports backed up on sidings across half the sector, while the Directorate sorted out which colony had capacity to receive them. 6 weeks of a sealed car full of starving children sitting on a siding, because a schedule had failed somewhere 1,000 light-years away, guarded by 2 bored troopers who checked the seal twice a day, and otherwise treated the assignment as the least interesting posting in the sector. 6 weeks was long enough for Eli to build a routine. He couldn't feed 14 children on a scalehouse worker's ration without someone noticing, and he understood from the first night that this was the actual, load-bearing fact of the entire situation. Not whether it was right to feed them, which was never a question he spent any time on, but whether he could do it without the depot's automated grain count matrices flagging a shortfall that would land on every worker at Bramwell, not just him. He solved it the way a man solves a problem when the problem is the only thing standing between children and starving to death in a train car, badly and carefully, and at real cost to himself. He gave up his own second ration first, the half-shift bonus that was supposed to be paying for his grandmother's medicine, which meant he started trading favors and doing extra scalehouse shifts to cover the gap instead, which meant less sleep, which he decided he could afford better than 14 children could afford to keep starving. He started collecting the depot's chaff sweep, grain dust and broken kernels swept up off the floor at shift's end, technically waste, technically supposed to be logged and destroyed as spoilage, technically the kind of thing that would earn him a formal citation if a compliance auditor ever cross-checked the sweep logs against what actually went into the incinerator. He started boiling it into a thin gruel in an old feed bucket on a hot plate. He ran off a maintenance circuit at 2 in the morning, and carrying it out to the siding in a thermos meant for his own coffee, and passing it through the ventilation slat one careful cupful at a time, while 2 bored troopers slept in their guard shack 30 meters away. His grandmother noticed before anyone else did, because grandmothers noticed everything that mattered and most of what didn't. Nan Rourke had raised Eli's father on this same depot, and buried a husband to a Directorate mining contract long before Eli was born, and she had the particular unfooled patience of a woman who had watched 3 generations of her family get thinner in service of somebody else's quota. She caught him on the 2nd week, weighing out his own dinner into a smaller portion than she'd set on the table, and didn't ask him why. She simply started setting the table with less on her own plate too, and when Eli tried to argue, she told him, in the flat tone she used for facts she didn't intend to debate, that she'd already had her share of a long life, and he could spend his worrying about someone who hadn't. She never once asked what the extra food was for. She only asked, on the 9th night, whether whoever it was for was warm enough, and when Eli admitted the transport car had no heating allowance beyond what 14 bodies generated on their own, she went into her cedar chest and came out with the quilt she'd been married under, and told him to find a way to get it through a ventilation slat too narrow for a grown man's arm, and to not ask her how she expected him to manage that, because that part was his problem. He learned Kess's name properly on the 4th night, and learned that she was doing exactly what he was, dividing everything always, into 14 exact shares before she let herself have anything, checking each of the younger children's faces, every time he came with the same flat assessing look she'd given him the first night. A girl of maybe 10 years old running triage on a train car full of orphans with the seriousness of someone 3 times her age. He learned that the Sethari had a word for what she was doing on the 11th night, when she used it to explain, in the halting, patched-together handful of Directorate standard words she'd started picking up from him, why she made every child repeat his name back to her before they were allowed to eat. Kindred thread, she said, tapping 2 fingers against her own temple. We do not write, we say it does not get lost. You're memorizing me, Eli said. She looked at him like the observation was almost insultingly obvious. 14 names, she said. All of them I keep. You I keep too. He didn't understand, that 11th night, what it meant that a Sethari child had decided to keep him the same way she was keeping the names of the 13 other children she was responsible for. He understood it a great deal better 9 years later, but that night he only understood that she'd made him repeat his own full name back to her 3 times until she had it exactly right, syllable for syllable, and that something about the seriousness with which she did it made him tell her about his father. On the 14th night she taught him, in exchange, the shape of a Sethari naming right. Not the whole of it, she was careful to explain, because the full right belonged to a homeworld none of them would ever stand on again, and a priesthood that had died with it, but the piece that mattered to 14 children with no elders left to perform it properly. Each child's name, spoken aloud by every other child in the group in a fixed order, once at dawn and once at dusk, so that even in a sealed train car with no calendar and no daylight to mark the hours, they kept something that functioned like time passing and something that functioned like belonging, both at once. She made Eli stand at the slat for both recitations that night, silent, listening to 14 names said in order twice, and told him afterward, matter-of-factly, that she'd added his to the end of the list 3 nights earlier, and hadn't told him because she wanted to see how long it took him to notice on his own that she'd started saying it too. He gave her one of the carved birds on the 17th night. He hadn't planned to. He'd brought the thermos and the news, delivered flatly because there was no way to deliver it any other way, that a supply officer had come through that afternoon asking pointed questions about grain sweep totals that didn't reconcile, and that he thought not knew, but thought someone was starting to notice the shortfall. Kes had taken the news the way she took everything, with a stillness that made her look older than her body was. "Then you stop," she said. "Before they catch." "I'm not stopping. They will hurt you." "I know." She looked at him for a long moment through the ventilation slat, and then said, in the clearest sentence of standard she'd managed yet, "Then I keep you very well." And Eli, not knowing what else to give a person who had just said that to him, dug the smallest of his father's 11 birds out of his coat, a wren, the wood gone smooth from 9 years in his father's pocket and 4 more in his own, and passed it through the slat. "My father made these," he said. "It's the only thing of his I've got that isn't a debt. Keep it well, and I'll believe you kept the rest of it too." She closed her hand around the bird and didn't say anything at all, which from Kes was its own kind of answer. The youngest of the 14, a boy Kes called Vray who couldn't have been older than 4, went feverish on the 22nd night, and Eli spent that whole night and the next lying to his grandmother about a stomach complaint, so he could sit up boiling willow bark into a tea bitter enough to make even a starving child's face twist, and passing it through the slat cup by cup until the fever broke on the 3rd morning. Kes didn't sleep either of those nights. She held Vray against her own body for warmth the way Eli imagined she'd been doing since the pacification, and when the fever finally broke, she looked at Eli through the ventilation slats with something in her face that wasn't gratitude exactly. Gratitude assumed a debt that could be settled. It was closer to recognition, the specific look of someone confirming a decision she'd already made about him and finding it hadn't been wrong. One of the 2 Garchak troopers, a bored, petty man named Dresh who treated the posting as beneath him and made sure everyone around him knew it, took to rapping his knuckles hard against the transport car's hull whenever he passed it on rounds purely, as far as Eli could ever tell, because the flinch it produced from inside amused him. Kes never let the younger children startle where Dresh could see it. She'd learned, faster than any of the others, that a visible reaction was the only currency Dresh had figured out how to extract from people he couldn't otherwise touch, and she refused, out of what Eli came to understand as pure stubborn will, to let him have it. She started positioning herself nearest the hull on his rounds, absorbing the flinch herself so the younger ones wouldn't have to. And on the one night Dresh escalated from knuckle raps to slamming his baton flat against the metal inches from where a 6-year-old was sleeping, Kes put her whole body between the sound and the child before it finished ringing, and held that position, silent, staring back through the slat at a grown man twice her size with an expression that had nothing childlike left in it at all, until he got bored and moved on. She never told Eli about it. He only learned it happened because the 6-year-old, too young yet to have learned Kes's discipline about staying quiet, told him herself the following night, in 3 words of broken standard, that Kes had stood for her. The near thing came on the 26th night, 3 nights before the audit, when a trooper doing an unscheduled walk-around caught the tail end of Eli crossing the yard with an empty thermos and asked him, not unkindly, what a scalehouse worker was doing out past curfew. Eli told him he'd left a moisture probe in the number 1 house and had come back for it, which was true in the sense that he had, in fact, left a moisture probe there 3 days earlier and had every intention of eventually retrieving it. The trooper accepted the answer with the particular incuriosity of a man 40 minutes from the end of a boring shift, and Eli walked the rest of the way back to his cot with his hands shaking in a way they hadn't shaken even the first night he'd opened the ventilation panel, because he understood, with sudden and total clarity, exactly how close 6 weeks of careful arithmetic had just come to ending on an ordinary Tuesday for no reason at all. The supply officer's questions turned into a formal audit on the 29th night. Eli had known it was coming and hadn't stopped anyway, because the alternative was watching 14 children starve on a schedule he could see clearly now. 2 of the younger ones had already stopped crying, which was worse than crying, and Kes had started dividing her own share into 15ths instead of 14ths, and not eating at all some nights, and he understood exactly what that meant, and refused to let it happen on his watch regardless of what an audit found. The audit found a shortfall of grain sweep totals that didn't reconcile across 6 weeks, at a depot with exactly 1 worker running unsupervised night rotations on the relevant scale house, and it took the Directorate's compliance officer less than a day to draw the obvious line between the numbers and the name. Eli knew the audit was closing on him a full 2 nights before it did, knew it from the way the supply officer's questions had shifted from general to specific, from "have you noticed shortfall" to "were you on rotation the night of?" He had time in those 2 nights to stop. He understood exactly what stopping would have cost him. Nothing. A quiet return to a scale house worker's ordinary invisible life, an unblemished record, a future with room in it to advance past night rotations eventually. He also understood what stopping would cost 14 children 3 days from a transport departure that would carry them somewhere with even less mercy in it than a siding in the cold. He didn't stop. He told himself, both of those last 2 nights, that he was simply buying time until the transport moved on, and the problem resolved itself without his help being needed anymore. He knew, even as he told himself that it wasn't really why he kept going out to the slat with a thermos every night until they caught him. He kept going because some decisions, once made honestly enough the first time, don't require remaking every night after. Lassen had set the trap 2 nights early on purpose, once the audit's suspicion narrowed to a single name, pulled the guard shack rotation off the siding entirely, left the ventilation panel looking unwatched, and waited in the dark of the number 1 scale house instead, patient in the specific way of a man who has already decided how satisfying the outcome is going to be. Eli walked straight into it with an empty thermos in one hand and the last of that night's chaff sweep gruel already delivered, and never saw the ambush coming until Lassen's light hit him full in the face, and 4 troopers closed in from both sides of the gantry stairs at once. They caught him on the 41st night, coming back from the siding with an empty thermos, and Warden Corvick Lassen, young then, a junior enforcer new to the Bramwell posting and hungry to make an impression on a directorate that rewarded exactly that kind of hunger, put him on his knees in the yard in front of the whole night shift, and read the charge aloud like it was a gift he was giving himself. Theft of Tithe-designated material, unauthorized contact with sealed tribute cargo, structural risk to depot compliance standing. 40 lashes, a full turning in the pit quarries 3 systems out, and the part that would follow Eli for the next 9 years in every Directorate file that ever touched his name, a permanent structural risk designation on Bramwell Depot itself, because Lassen wanted the whole town to remember what happened when a compliance failure went unreported. They moved the transport out that same night. 6 weeks of routing delay resolved with sudden, brutal efficiency, once the Directorate had a reason to want the evidence gone. Eli got one look at the car pulling out chained on his knees, blood already running down his back from the first 10 lashes, Lassen's boot on his shoulder holding him down, and in that one look, he saw Kes pressed against the ventilation slat with both hands wrapped around something small, and heard her voice carry across the yard in the clearest standard she had ever managed, every syllable placed with the precision of a vow being sworn rather than a farewell being shouted. "Eli Rourke," she said, "I keep you." The transport pulled out. The lashes continued. Eli didn't see Kes again for 9 years, and never, in all that time, stopped believing that whatever a 10-year-old girl meant by "I keep you" asterisk, she had meant it exactly as seriously as she meant everything else. The pit quarry's 3 systems outran on a schedule designed to extract labor efficiently, and nothing else. 16-hour shifts, breaking or bearing rock with tools older than the men swinging them. A mess hall that served the same gray protein paste twice a day, and a guard rotation that treated every prisoner's name as an inconvenience not worth learning. Eli's back never fully lost the marks from the 40 lashes. The quarry work opened 2 of them back up in the first month before they scarred over for good. He wrote his grandmother once a season, the maximum the quarry's mail allowance permitted, and got back 3 letters in 11 months before a 4th never came, and he understood what that meant without needing anyone to confirm it, and finished his sentence anyway because there was no version of the schedule that let him finish it faster by understanding it sooner. He came back from the pit quarries 11 months later with his grandmother already 3 months dead, and a structural risk designation that meant no depot in the sector would advance him past scalehouse labor no matter how good he was at it. And he did the only thing that made any sense to a man in his position, which was to keep working the same yard, under the same designation, and to start. Without any plan behind it, beyond the fact that he could not stand the idea of one more child going hungry on his watch, quietly keeping an eye on the small handful of Bramwell kids whose parents had been lost to levies or lashings, or the general grinding attrition of an occupied world's economics. Milo had come to him 4 years later that way, 8 years old now, but 4 when Eli found him, half-starved and hiding in the depot's grain silo after both his parents died in the same Tithe fever winter that took a dozen other Bramwell families, curled up in the dark between 2 grain augers with a coat too thin for the season, and a face that had already learned not to expect anyone to come looking. Eli had sat down on the silo floor beside him without trying to pick him up or talk him out of the corner, and had simply put half a meat pie down within reach and waited, the exact patience he'd learned 9 years earlier through a ventilation slat, until the boy decided on his own that reaching for it was safe. It took 40 minutes. Eli had counted every one of them, and had done for Milo exactly what an 18-year-old version of himself had once done for 14 strangers on a siding, because it turned out to be the only shape of decision he actually knew how to make. That was who Governor Ilsa Draeth's requisition officer found standing in the yard when she reached the 4th name on her slate. Eli Rourke, she read. Prior structural risk designation, this site 9 years standing. Remediation review effective immediately. 2 troopers moved toward him before the sentence finished. Eli didn't run, because there was nowhere on Bramwell to run to that wouldn't cost Milo more than it cost him to stay, and because he had learned 9 years ago, on his knees in this exact yard, that resistance in the moment bought nothing and running bought less. He let them take his arms. He watched the requisition officer's slate for the next name, hoping, with the specific dull dread of a man who had done this calculation before, that it wasn't Seth, or the Aldous boy, or anyone else whose only crime was working under him. It was 3 more names, all older men who'd worked the depot for decades, and had nothing to do with any of it beyond bad luck and proximity. Draeth's second tithe order didn't care about guilt. It cared about examples, and Bramwell's 9-year-old shrinkage flag made it an efficient place to make one. Warden Lassen dismounted his runner and walked the length of the apron to where the troopers held Eli, and looked at him with the particular satisfaction of a man revisiting a favorite accomplishment. 9 years, Lassen said. I told you the file would follow you. Nobody ever believes me about the file. Get on with it, Eli said, because there was nothing else worth saying to Corvik Lassen, and because he'd learned that giving Lassen a reaction was its own kind of currency, and he didn't intend to spend any more of it than he had to. Compliance roll first, grain seizure. Then the example town square public, same as the order specifies. Lassen smiled, thin and pleased with himself. The governor wants this one scene. Second tithe's going to be a hard swallow across the whole sector, and a depot that's already got a compliance flag on file makes a tidy demonstration for everybody else on the line who might get creative ideas about grain sweep totals. They held Eli and the other 3 named men in the number 1 scale house through the middle of the day, while the seizure count went on outside, long enough for Eli to hear, through the thin corrugated wall, every sack of the season's harvest getting weighed and logged and loaded, the depot's entire winter reduced to a running tally read aloud by a Directorate clerk in the flat, unbothered voice of someone reading off a shopping list. Ada Kessler, whose husband Petter was one of the other 3 named men, spent most of that stretch standing at the fence line with her 2 children, not shouting, not pleading, because 9 years of occupation had taught Bramwell exactly how little either accomplished, only watching, the specific silent watching of people memorizing a day they expected to need to describe to someone later. Milo tried twice to get past the trooper posted at the scale house door and was turned back twice, and the second time he stopped trying and simply sat down in the dirt outside the door where Eli could hear him through the wall, not crying, just sitting, in a way that told Eli the boy had decided crying wouldn't get him anything either, and had chosen the only other thing available to him, which was staying close. By mid-afternoon, the requisition officer's final count came back 11% under the second tithe order's demand. Bramwell simply didn't have 18,000 bushels to give, drought or no drought, compliance flag or no compliance flag. And it was the shortfall itself, reported up a Directorate channel with the same flat clerical indifference as everything else that day, that Draeth's office would later cite as the justification for escalating a routine tithe seizure into a full compliance example. The math had never been meant to work. Eli understood that with the same clarity he'd understood it 9 years earlier. The numbers weren't the point. What happened to the people standing near the numbers was. The requisition officer moved on to the grain office to begin the seizure count, and troopers fanned out along the storage bays, and Eli stood in the apron with his arms held and watched 9 years' worth of the exact fear he'd learned to live inside come walking back toward him in Directorate green, and understood, with a cold clarity that had nothing left in it to panic about, that this time there was no 11-year-old sister to slip food to, and no version of the math that ended with him walking away from it. He was wrong about that, though he had no way of knowing it yet, because 3 systems away and closing at a burn rate her engineers would be complaining about for a week. A woman who had spent 9 years turning herself into someone capable of doing something about an unpaid debt was 3 minutes out from a relay drop, reading a compliance roll off an intercepted Directorate feed, and had just watched a name she had never once in 9 years stopped looking for appear on a public arrest manifest. The Kindred's vow broke Sol orbit insertion with an aggression that had her flight officer requesting, twice, formal confirmation that the Queen understood the fuel margin cost of the approach she'd ordered. Vesherin confirmed it both times without looking up. She was not, in the 9 years since the transport pulled off the Bramwell siding, a person who had spent her time waiting. The surviving 13 children of that transport, 14, counting herself, had scattered across 3 different labor colonies within a year of arrival, split up by administrative convenience with no more thought given to keeping them together than had been given to keeping their homeworld intact. Kes had ended up on a mining colony called Vessex Drift, assigned to ore-sorting labor at an age when most children on more fortunate worlds were still learning to read, and she had done there what she had done on the transport siding, divided what little there was, kept careful account of everyone she could reach, and refused, with a stubbornness that colony administrators found variously useful and infuriating, to let the scattering of her people become its erasure. She built the Kindred thread into something larger than a memory game for frightened children on a train car. She used it deliberately as an organizing principle. Every Sethari she reached, on every colony her increasingly resourceful network of contacts could touch, was asked to recite what they remembered. Names, kinships, debts owed and owing, the location of every scattered fragment of a homeworld the Directorate had declared fully pacified and closed the file on. By the time she was 16, she had a working census of 900 surviving Sethari across 11 colonies that the Directorate's own records didn't have, because the Directorate had never bothered to ask. Vray, the fever child from the transport car, grown now into a broad-shouldered young man who still flinched at cold the way people do, when a childhood illness leaves its mark somewhere the body doesn't forget, had been the first of the 13 she found again, tracked down to an ore processing colony 2 jumps from Vessex Drift when she was 14, and he was 10. And the reunion had cost her 3 months' worth of traded labor shifts to a colony administrator willing to falsify a transfer manifest. She kept him close after that, trained him into her own honor guard the moment she had a guard to train, because some debts, she told Orrin once, you don't discharge by remembering them. You discharge them by making sure the person never has cause to wonder if you meant it. By the time she was 19, that census had become leverage, because the Corvane throne's frontier war had created an unglamorous but very real problem. Encrypted logistics coordination across a war front stretched thin over hostile approaches, run by cipher systems that broke under sustained enemy analysis faster than the Directorate's cryptographers could rebuild them. Sethari kindred thread, a communication and memory tradition built over centuries around perfect, uncorrupted person-to-person recitation across long distances with no written record to intercept, turned out to be exactly the kind of unbreakable, decentralized encryption a desperate war effort would pay almost any price to access. Kess had not given it to them for free. She had given the Corvane throne exactly what her people needed in exchange: recognition. A client throne, formally ratified, with her own diaspora consolidated under her rule for the first time since the pacification, real standing in imperial court, a modest fleet, and because she had insisted on it in the treaty negotiations with a patience that had frustrated 3 separate imperial legal councils across 8 months of drafting. A specific, narrowly defined, but entirely real legal instrument buried in Article 12 of the Sethari Concord Accords. The conquered crown standing right to petition, direct imperial intervention on behalf of any individual to whom the crown held a formally recorded life debt. Everyone involved in drafting that clause had assumed it existed to protect Sethari citizens abroad. Kess had let them assume it. She had known, from the day she pressed her thumbprint to the ratification, exactly whose name she intended to use it for first, the moment she finally found him. It had taken 9 years to find him, because a nameless human boy on an unlisted maintenance rotation at an unlisted depot had left almost no trace in any record the Directorate bothered to keep, and because Kess, Vesherin now, throne named at her coronation with a word her people used for someone who does not let a debt go unpaid regardless of the years it costs, had refused every piece of advice from every counselor who told her the search was a poor use of a young sovereign's limited political capital. Article 12 itself had nearly died in drafting. The throne's own legal counsel, a senior jurist named Ket Pharaoh who had negotiated a dozen client throne accords before Vesherin's and expected this one to run the same well-worn template, had struck the life debt clause from the second draft entirely, calling it an unnecessary complication with no precedent and no clear limiting principle. A clause that could, in theory, obligate the throne to intervene anywhere a Sethari citizen claimed a debt. An open-ended liability no imperial council would sign off on lightly. Vesherin had reinstated it herself, in front of Pharaoh and 2 other counselors, in a session Orrin still described, when he told the story at all, as the single most stubborn 90 minutes he had ever witnessed in 8 years of diplomatic service. She had not raised her voice once. She had simply restated, every time Pharaoh objected, that the clause would be narrowly worded, formally documented, and rarely invoked, and that she would rather walk away from the entire accord than sign a treaty that gave her people everything except the one thing that had kept 14 starving children alive on a siding: the certainty that a debt, once owed, would eventually be paid. Pharaoh had relented in the end, not because he agreed with her reasoning, but because it became clear, 90 minutes in, that she genuinely would rather have no treaty at all than one without it. And no imperial council wanted to be the reason a valuable new client throne accord collapsed over a single narrow clause nobody expected to matter. She had found him 3 weeks ago, through the patient, decade-long work of a Sethari trade auditor, who had finally cross-referenced a scalehouse maintenance log against a pit quarry sentencing record against a depot name that matched a smell of chaff dust gruel, and a wren carved from fence-post oak that Vesherin still wore on a cord under her ceremonial collar, every single day, exactly as promised. And now, 3 minutes from atmosphere, she had watched him get arrested for the second time in his life for the same unpaid debt, and she intended to make certain it was the last time. Governor Draeth will have grounds to lodge a formal protest over the approach, Oren said, watching the burn telemetry with the resigned expression of a man who had made his objection and was now simply along for whatever came next. Unscheduled arrival, no clearance transponder acknowledged, hot insertion inside a populated system's traffic lanes. She can lodge it after. Vesherin. Oren used her birth-adjacent register rarely and always meant it when he did. Whatever you find on the ground, the Article 12 petition is real, the clause is real, but the moment you invoke it in front of the man himself, in front of witnesses, there is no version of this that stays quiet. The whole sector will know within a day that the Sethari crown crossed system lines and interrupted a sovereign Directorate compliance action over one human depot worker. Draeth will be humiliated in front of her own command. That has consequences we cannot walk back afterward. Good, Vesherin said. Sorn's status on the audit package. Counselor Yeva Sorn, seated at the legal station behind them with the flat, unhurried calm of a woman who had spent 4 years quietly building exactly the kind of file that made ambitious regional governors disappear, didn't look up from her console. Complete and cross-verified, Majesty. 11 months of Bramwell sector tithe manifests against actual second tithe delivery records logged at 3 separate Directorate receiving points. Draeth's office has been filing a 14% spoilage and loss allowance against every shipment out of this sector since the second tithe edict took effect. Actual spoilage at the receiving end runs under 2%. The difference has been routed, through 2 Shell logistics contracts, into a private shipping account registered to Draeth's household. She's been skimming her own tithe quota. For 8 months, Majesty. Enough that when Central Audit finally looks, and they will look, the moment this file reaches them, there will be no version of events where Governor Draeth survives it as a career, whatever happens to Eli Rourke today. Then we make certain Central Audit looks today. Vesherin finally allowed herself to sit back from the console, and for the first time since the priority flag had reached her that morning, something in her posture eased, not relief, not yet, but the particular settling of a person who had spent 9 years preparing for exactly this moment and had just confirmed every piece of the preparation was going to hold. Oren. Full honor escort, formal conquered colors, and I want the recording relay live the moment we touch ground, not for the Directorate's benefit. For his. The Kindred's vow broke atmosphere over the Bramwell sector 11 minutes later, trailing 3 escort cutters in tight formation, running full formal transponder broadcast at a volume that guaranteed every Directorate listening post within 400 kilometers picked it up within seconds. Because Vesherin had no intention of arriving quietly, and every intention of arriving in a way that no Directorate officer on the ground could later claim they hadn't understood exactly, who had just entered their airspace. Governor Ilsa Draeth was in her sector office 40 kilometers from Bramwell when the alert reached her, An unidentified vessel breaking Sol orbit insertion on a hot burn with no clearance transponder acknowledged. Running Concord diplomatic broadcast at full volume. Inbound trajectory converging directly on the Bramwell sector. Her aide read the transponder identification off the alert twice before she believed it. The Sethari Crown, he said. Majesty Vesheren's own flagship. Unscheduled, Governor. No advance notice through any channel. Draeth's first reaction was not alarm. It was irritation, the specific irritation of an administrator who had spent 8 months building a controlled, deniable arrangement out of second tithe spoilage margins, and did not appreciate variables she hadn't accounted for arriving without warning. Her second reaction, arriving roughly 4 seconds later once she'd pulled up the vow's registered specifications and cross-referenced them against the compliance action already underway at Bramwell, was considerably closer to alarm, though 30 years of Directorate administration meant nothing in her voice showed it. "Get me transit time to Bramwell," she said. "And pull every file we hold on why a client-throned sovereign would burn diplomatic fuel margin to reach a grain depot with a 9-year-old shrinkage flag on it, because I promise you it isn't about the grain." She reached the square 11 minutes after the vow's arrival, which meant 11 minutes in which she had nothing to do but travel and think. And by the time her transport set down at the edge of Bramwell's apron, she had already run the arithmetic on Article 12 3 times without finding a version that favored her, and had arrived, with the flat professional resignation of someone who had survived a career by knowing exactly when a position could no longer be defended. At the understanding that today was going to cost her something, she simply hadn't yet worked out how much. In the town square at Bramwell, Governor Ilsa Draeth's remediation officer read the second tithe seizure total off her slate to a crowd of 700 people standing in the kind of silence that comes from watching a winter's food supply get loaded onto Directorate trucks one sack at a time. And Warden Corvik Lassen walked Eli Rourke, and the 3 other men named on the compliance roll up onto a raised platform built. Eli noted with the same flat clarity he'd had 9 years ago on his knees in this same yard, for exactly this purpose. "Bramwell Depot," Draeth's officer announced, "has met its second tithe obligation in full. Compliance remediation will now proceed as ordered." Eli found Milo in the crowd before Lassen got him into position on the platform, Seth Halloran holding the boy's shoulder with both hands, Milo's face white and furious and trying, badly, not to show either. Eli held the boy's eyes for as long as he could and mouthed one word, the only thing he had time to give him: "Stay." Lassen produced the lash himself. 9 years of rank hadn't cured him of wanting to do this part personally. "Bramwell's had 9 years to remember what a compliance failure costs," Lassen said, loud enough to carry across the whole square, savoring it. "Let's make sure the next 9 remember it a little better." The first strike never landed. What landed instead first was sound. 3 escort cutters coming in low and fast over the depot's grain silos in tight formation, running lights blazing Concord colors that not one person in that square had ever seen before, but every Directorate trooper recognized on sight from a dozen mandatory recognition briefings. Because a client throne's formal colors were the kind of thing an occupying administration made very certain its officers could identify. Behind the cutters, larger and slower and utterly unmistakable, the Kindred's vow settled into a hover directly above the town square at an altitude calculated, with precision, to put the largest ship anyone in Bramwell had ever seen close enough to feel the downdraft off its stabilizers without putting a single person on the ground at risk. Lassen's arm, raised for the strike, froze there. Every Directorate trooper in the square came to a stillness that had nothing to do with any order given. The specific, involuntary stillness of soldiers whose training has just collided with something their training never covered. A client-throned sovereign's warship close enough overhead to rattle loose grain dust off the depot's roofline, and not one of them so much as glanced toward Draeth's absent authority for instruction. because there was no protocol on file for what to do when the balance of a scene like this one shifted that fast, and that completely. The Vow's forward hatch opened before it had finished settling, and a boarding ramp extended into a square gone utterly silent, and down it walked a formal honor guard in Concord's ceremonial dress that every Directorate trooper present recognized as diplomatic-grade regalia, and behind the guard, unhurried, dressed in the deep blue-black of a reigning sovereign, with a small carved bird worn openly on a cord at her throat, where any ceremonial protocol officer would recognize it instantly as a mounted regalia piece, walked Vesherin, Queen of the Sethari Concord. At the front of the honor guard, close enough to the Queen's shoulder that his rank was obvious even to Directorate eyes that had never seen Concord insignia before, walked a broad-shouldered young man whose gaze went straight past the troopers and the platform and the lash still frozen in Lassen's raised hand, and landed instead on a stretch of ordinary depot apron he had last seen from inside a train car, 30 meters from a guard shack he still, 9 years on, sometimes saw in his own dreams. "Governor Draeth," Vesherin said, and her voice carried across the square without any visible effort, pitched with the particular flatness of someone who had rehearsed this exact sentence for 9 years and intended to deliver it without a single wasted word. "I am informed a second Tithe compliance remediation is in progress at this site. I am invoking Article 12 of the Sethari Concord Accords, in the presence of witnesses, on behalf of a recorded life debt held by the Sethari Crown." Seth Halloran, watching from beside the No. 2 scale house with Milo's shoulder still gripped tight in one hand, said nothing for a long moment, and then, quietly to nobody in particular, "9 years I've worked this yard next to him and never once heard the whole of it." Around him, the crowd had gone from the flat, watchful silence of people bracing for an example to something else entirely, not cheering, because Bramwell had learned a long time ago that cheering in front of Directorate Green cost more than it was worth, but a low, spreading murmur of people turning to each other to ask variations of the same question. Did you know, did anyone know, and finding that nobody had, that Eli Rourke had carried the actual shape of his 9-year-old flag alone for 9 years without once explaining it to a single neighbor who might have thought better of him for it? Governor Ilsa Draeth arrived at the square 11 minutes after her ship's arrival, having covered the distance from her sector office at a speed that told Eli, watching from the platform where 2 troopers still held his arms out of pure reflex, exactly how badly this had already gone sideways for her before she'd even had a chance to assess it. She was a compact woman with the controlled, unhurried bearing of someone who had survived a career in Directorate administration by never once being caught looking rattled, and she managed, even now, to walk into a town square occupied by a foreign sovereign's warship with her composure fully intact. "Your Majesty," Draeth's bow was correct to the exact degree protocol demanded, and not 1 degree more. "This is an unscheduled arrival inside an active Directorate compliance action. I'll require formal explanation before I can permit." "You will require nothing," Vesherin said, "beyond what I have already stated. Article 12 is not subject to a Directorate governor's permission. It is imperial law ratified by the throne itself at my coronation. You may lodge a challenge through proper channels if you believe the clause has been misapplied. You may not detain the individual named in the petition while that challenge is pending." "The individual is human," Draeth said, and there was the first crack in her composure, a note of genuine confusion rather than pure procedural stalling. "Article 12 governs Sethari citizens abroad. It has no standing over a Directorate compliance matter involving a human worker on occupied territory." Councillor Sorn stepped forward at Vesherin's shoulder, data slate already raised, and her voice carried the particular satisfaction of a lawyer who had spent 4 years anticipating this exact objection and building the answer to it into the treaty language itself, clause by careful clause, precisely so it would be waiting the day it was needed. Article 12, subsection 4, Governor. The Crown's petition applies to any individual to whom the conquered holds a formally recorded life debt, species notwithstanding, so long as the debt is documented under conquered recitation law prior to the petition. The clause was drafted with exactly that language, on the Crown's own insistence, and ratified without objection by 3 imperial legal councils and the throne's own signing office. You are welcome to review the ratification record. It is a matter of public imperial law, Governor, not a favor. Draeth's aide, hovering at her shoulder with the particular anxious energy of a man watching his superior's morning collapse in real time, murmured something Eli couldn't hear. Draeth's expression didn't change, but something in the set of her shoulders did, the recalibration of a person doing very fast, very unwelcome arithmetic on exactly how much of her position this was going to cost her. She tried once more anyway, because 30 years of Directorate administration had taught her that a losing position still sometimes yielded ground if pressed correctly. Formal recording under conquered recitation law is not a standard imperial legal instrument, Counselor. I'd want to see how a spoken tradition with no written registry satisfies an evidentiary bar that every other client throne accord requires in documented form. It satisfies it, Soren said, because Article 12's ratification specifically names kindred thread recitation as an admissible recording method for Sethari-originated debts, on the throne's own signature, precisely to accommodate a culture that does not keep written registries, and because I have, prepared and ready to submit to any tribunal that wishes to review it, sworn recitation testimony from 13 separate witnesses, each independently able to recite the debt's full particulars. Name, date, location terms, in agreement with one another to the syllable. Gathered years apart and continents apart with no opportunity to coordinate a story between them. I would invite you to find a written Directorate ledger with that standard of corroboration, Governor. I have yet to encounter one. Draeth held Soren's gaze for a long moment, and then, for the first time since she'd stepped off her transport, allowed something like genuine respect to surface through the professional flatness. You built this file a long time before this morning. 9 years, Governor, Vesherin said. I would not have crossed 3 systems on the strength of anything less. The life debt in question, Vesherin said, before Draeth could recover her footing, was recorded 9 years ago on a Bramwell rail siding by 14 Sethari children who owe their survival to one human worker who fed them from his own ration for 6 weeks at cost to himself, was punished for it with 40 lashes and a full turning in the pit quarries, and has carried a structural risk designation on his record ever since. Which is the specific designation your officer used this morning to place his name on a public compliance example. Vesherin turned, for the first time, to look directly at the platform where Lassen still stood with the lash lowered but not set down, and where Eli stood between 2 troopers who had, without anyone giving the order, quietly loosened their grip on his arms. Eli Rourke, she said, and 9 years fell out of her voice on the second syllable of his name, the flat sovereign formality cracking just slightly around something that had been waiting a very long time to be said out loud in front of him. I told you I would keep you. Eli had spent 9 years building a life around the specific discipline of not thinking too hard about a 10-year-old girl's voice carrying across a yard while he bled from the first 10 of 40 lashes. He had not built any discipline at all for what it would feel like to hear that same voice, grown into a sovereign's register, say the same sentence back to him in front of 700 witnesses and a warship blotting out the sky. You found me, was all he managed to say. I never stopped looking. Vesherin crossed the square without any particular hurry, the honor guard falling back to let her pass, and stopped at the base of the platform close enough that Eli could see the bird at her throat wasn't a reproduction or a formal regalia commission. It was the actual wren, worn smooth in exactly the places a 9-year-old's hand would have worn it smooth, mounted now in a setting fine enough for a queen but unmistakably the same small piece of fence-post oak he'd pressed through a ventilation slat a lifetime ago. You told me to keep it well, and I would believe you kept the rest. I have kept both. I would like you to come down off that platform now, if the warden has finished. Lassen had not moved. He stood with the lash still in one hand, looking at a client-throned sovereign's honor guard, a warship, and an Article 12 invocation that had just publicly gutted the legal basis for every part of what he'd been about to do, and made the calculation, visibly, in real time on his face, that there was no version of continuing that ended well for him. Vray stepped out of formation without waiting for an order, crossed the platform, and took the lash out of Lassen's hand with the unhurried economy of someone who had spent years training for exactly the kind of moment where he'd need his hands to be steadier than the other man's. He didn't strike him with it. He simply held it and looked at the warden with the flat, patient assessment of a man who remembered, in perfect kindred thread detail passed down from a 10-year-old girl's account of the worst night of her transport, every word Lassen had said while a human boy bled in front of a train car full of frightened children. Your name is in the recitation too, Vray told him, in standard practice smooth enough that Lassen understood every syllable of it. We keep all of it, not only the debts we owe. Release him, Draeth said, before Lassen could decide for himself, because whatever else was true about Ilsa Draeth, she had not survived a Directorate career by failing to recognize the exact moment a losing position needed to be abandoned rather than defended. Release all four. The compliance role is suspended pending review. Peter Kessler came down off the platform on unsteady legs to where Ada was already pushing through the crowd toward him, and the other two men followed. And for the first time since the trucks had rolled into Bramwell's yard that morning, the square held the specific unclenching quiet of people realizing, all at the same moment, that the worst version of the day was no longer the version that was going to happen. Not suspended, Vecherin said. Withdrawn. Article 12 is specific to the individual named in the petition, Governor, but I would draw your attention to a second matter, since you have already summoned yourself to this square. She nodded once, and Sorn stepped forward and extended the data slate directly toward Draeth's aide. Councillor Sorn will forward you a complete audit package, documenting a 14% discrepancy between logged spoilage allowances and actual delivery losses across every second Tithe shipment out of this sector for the last 8 months, and the private logistics contracts through which the difference has been routed. This has already been transmitted to Central Audit's office at the Throne, with a formal request that they open review immediately given the ongoing hardship the second Tithe edict is causing across occupied sectors that can genuinely least afford further loss. Her voice did not rise, did not sharpen, carried nothing that could be mistaken for gloating, hard-eyed, and level, the voice of someone stating a fact she had already made certain was true. I would encourage you to prepare your own account of that discrepancy, Governor, before Central Audit arrives to ask for one. Draeth's face went very still. Around her, Eli watched the depot's troopers, men and women who worked this sector, who had families rationed under the same second Tithe order, who had spent the morning loading a starving town's winter grain onto trucks because a superior's ambition demanded an example. Begin, quietly, to understand exactly what they had just watched happen to the officer who'd given the order. This will be raised through proper diplomatic channels, Draeth said, which both of them understood was the sound of a person conceding without the word itself ever being spoken. Your Majesty. I would expect nothing less, Vecherin said, and turned back to the platform and to Eli, and something in her carriage shifted. The sovereign's flatness set down briefly, the way a person sets down a weight they've been carrying so long it's become part of how they stand. Come down, she said again, quieter this time, meant for him alone even though the whole square could still hear it. You held the bird's promise for 9 years without knowing whether I'd survive to collect on it. I'd like to stop making you hold it alone." Eli came down off the platform on legs that didn't feel entirely his own, and stopped an arm's length from a woman he'd last seen as a 10-year-old pressed against a ventilation slat, and found he had no idea what the correct protocol was for standing in front of a queen who had just dismantled a Directorate governor's career to keep a promise made in a rail yard. Milo solved it for him, breaking away from Seth's grip and crossing the square at a dead run, skidding to a stop close enough to stare up at Vesherin with the frank, unguarded curiosity of an 8-year-old who had just watched a warship blot out the sun and now wanted to know, urgently, whether the bird on the lady's necklace was real. "It's real," Vesherin told him, crouching without any hesitation to bring herself level with his eyes, an economy of movement that told Eli, watching, that whatever else 9 years of rule had made her into, it hadn't made her into someone who'd forgotten how to talk to a frightened child. "Eli's father carved it. Eli gave it to me when I was younger than you are now, and I promised him I'd remember him for it. Do you know what a promise like that is worth?" Milo considered this with tremendous seriousness. "A lot." "Everything," Vesherin said. "It's worth crossing 3 systems to keep, when the time comes." Vray waited until the crowd had thinned before he came to Eli directly, and when Eli didn't place him, a broad-shouldered young man in Concord Guard dress had no obvious relation to a feverish 4-year-old glimpsed for 2 nights through a ventilation slat 9 years gone. Vray simply said, "Willow bark," and watched recognition land on Eli's face like a physical weight. "You made it taste terrible. I still remember exactly how terrible. Kess made me drink all of it anyway." His formal bearing cracked briefly into something younger. "I didn't think I would ever get to tell you it worked." "You're alive," Eli said, which felt like an inadequate thing to say to a man standing in front of him in full ceremonial dress, and knew it, and said it anyway because it was the only sentence his chest had room for. "I'm alive," Vray agreed. 13 of us are, scattered across 4 systems now, most of them with children of their own who have been raised on the story of a human boy and a willow bark tea that tasted like punishment. You're not a rumor to my people, Eli Rourke. You're a recitation. Every one of us can say your name in order, the way Kess taught us to say it, before we could say much else. The formal proceedings took the better part of the afternoon, Sorn's team cataloging the seized grain for return, a Concord logistics officer coordinating with what remained of Draeth's shaken administration to arrange emergency supplemental tithe relief for the sector's harvest shortfall, a diplomatic protocol officer drafting the language of a formal Concord Directorate liaison agreement that would, within the month, see Bramwell Depot reclassified under a permanent trade partnership designation, specifically exempting it from future punitive tithe actions on the strength of its status as a recognized Sethari life debt site. But Eli spent most of it standing at the edge of the square with Milo's hand fixed in his, watching a queen he had once known as a starving child on a siding move through the wreckage of a morning that had nearly cost him everything, and setting it right piece by careful piece, the same way she'd once divided a single ration bar into 14 exact shares. By evening, the trucks that had come to seize Bramwell's winter grain were gone, and different trucks, Concord relief transports, running lights the same deep blue-black as Vesherin's ceremonial dress, had taken their place at the loading apron, unloading enough supplemental grain to see the whole depot through the winter twice over. Draeth had departed under escort of her own remaining staff, her career's fate no longer a question she had any real say in. Lassen's fate took slightly longer to settle. Sorn's audit team had cross-referenced his original 9-year-old structural risk report against 3 other compliance citations he'd filed in the years since, and found a pattern ugly enough that the Directorate's own regional inspector, summoned by an urgent flag Sorn, made certain reached him within the hour, took Lassen into administrative custody before the day was finished. Not for anything done that afternoon, but for a decade of citations that turned out, once someone finally checked, to correlate a little too neatly with which depot workers had crossed him personally. It suited everyone at Bramwell fine either way. Vesherin found Eli alone at the #1 scale house as the light went gold and long across the yard. The same gantry stairs, the same stretch of apron where a 9-year-old had once fed him one syllable at a time, 30 meters from where a girl had once been chained inside a train car, and a man had once bled from 10 lashes with his knees in the dirt. "I built the whole clause around this exact scene," she said, standing where he could see the bird catch the last of the light. 9 years of drafting, 3 legal counsels, 8 months of negotiation over language nobody else in that room understood the real purpose of, and I built every word of it around the day I'd walk back into this yard and say your name in front of witnesses and make certain nobody could ever put you on your knees in it again. "You didn't have to make it a formal article," Eli said. "You could have just come. I could have come alone with a ship and a threat, and Draeth's superiors would have called it an act of aggression, and I'd have spent the next decade repairing a diplomatic incident instead of protecting you." She shook her head, and for a moment the sovereign's precision fell away entirely, and what was left was simply a woman who had spent 9 years turning grief and gratitude into the only kind of power that could actually reach across 3 systems and change what happened to a man in a rail yard. "I told you I'd keep you well. I meant it the way a queen keeps a promise, Eli, not the way a girl makes one. It took longer, it cost more to build. But it holds now in ways a girl's promise never could have." Eli looked at the bird at her throat, worn smooth by 2 lifetimes of hands, and understood, finally, the actual shape of what 9 years had built out of 1 ration bar broken into 14 pieces. "Then I suppose," he said, "I finally get to say thank you." "You already did," Vesherin said. 9 years ago, before you knew my name. You just didn't stay around long enough to hear it back." Milo tugged at Eli's sleeve, unable to contain himself a moment longer. "Does this mean we get to keep the extra grain, all of it, even through spring?" "Through spring," Vesherin confirmed, crouching again to his level, "and every winter after for as long as the conquered holds a throne to guarantee it. Bramwell belongs to the debt registry now. That doesn't change when a governor's temper does." The kindred's vow held station over Bramwell for 6 more days, while Sorn's team and the Concord's logistics officers finished the work that couldn't be done by nightfall. The trade partnership liaison agreement drafted, reviewed, and formally ratified over Draeth's replacement signature. A mild-mannered career administrator sent out from the Directorate's regional office with explicit instructions. Eli gathered from the man's own visibly nervous demeanor to avoid doing anything at all that might warrant a second personal visit from the Sethari crown. By the time the vow finally broke orbit for the return journey, Bramwell Depot carried a formal designation that would follow it in every Directorate record from that point forward: recognized Sethari life debt site, permanent trade partner status, exempt from punitive tithe action, absent a full Concord review, stamped into the same imperial ledgers that had once carried nothing about Eli Rourke beyond a 9-year-old structural risk flag. Vesherin came to the #1 scale house on the morning before departure, without the honor guard this time, dressed plainly enough that a passing trooper might have mistaken her for one of her own logistics staff, if not for the bird still worn openly at her throat. She found Eli exactly where she'd found him 6 days earlier, checking moisture readings on grain that would, this year, and for the first time in longer than Bramwell's records went back, see the whole town through winter with enough left over to plan a full spring besides. "I have to go back," she said. "There's a diaspora census update overdue, and a border dispute 2 systems out that won't wait for sentiment, however much I'd like it to. Being a sovereign mostly means learning which debts get to wait and which don't, and I've spent 9 years discovering that most of them, unfortunately, don't." "I know how that goes," Eli said. I've been running a scale house on the same principle since I was 18. She almost smiled at that, a small, unguarded thing that looked out of place on a face that had spent the last 6 days being uniformly regal in front of a sector's worth of Directorate officials, and all the more real for it. "Vray will stay," she said. "Not as a guard posting. As a liaison officially, so the paperwork satisfies somebody." Unofficially, he asked, and I couldn't think of a single good reason to tell him no, given that half of what he wants to do with the posting is teach Milo the parts of kindred thread that aren't crown business, which names get kept, and why, and how a person decides which debts are worth crossing 3 systems for. She looked past Eli, out toward the depot yard where Milo was, at that exact moment, attempting to teach Vray how to properly read a grain moisture gauge, and getting the sequence backward with the confident authority of an 8-year-old who had learned it exactly once. "I think he'll be good at it. Teaching, I mean. He has the patience for it." I recognized it the first day, actually. It's the same patience you had. "You're leaving him behind as a gift." "I'm leaving him behind because 13 of us have spent 9 years scattered across 4 systems learning to live with pieces of our own history stranded in places we couldn't reach," Vesherin said. "I'm not interested in repeating that shape of loss on purpose, not even a small version of it, not even for a good reason. Bramwell is conquered territory now in every way that matters. It should have a Sethari face in it that isn't only mine, passing through once every 9 years. She didn't offer him a formal farewell. She simply reached up and unhooked the cord at her throat, and for one unsteady second Eli thought she meant to give him back the wren itself, before she reached instead into a small case at her belt and produced a second bird, new, freshly carved, unmistakably shaped by the same hand that had carved the first, though it took Eli a moment to understand what that meant, because his father had been dead for going on 13 years, and had certainly never carved anything for a Sethari queen. "I had Vray learn the carving," she said, watching his face work through it. "Years ago, before I was certain I'd ever find you to give it to. I wanted something of yours in the recitation that wasn't only a debt owed. I wanted something that was also a thing we'd built together out of what your father started." She pressed the new bird into his hand, closing his fingers around it the same deliberate way he'd once closed hers around the original. "Keep this one for yourself. I have the first. Somewhere between the two of them, I think, is roughly the shape of what 9 years actually cost and what they were worth." Eli held the second bird for a long moment, turning it once in his palm, and found, for the first time since the trucks had rolled into Bramwell's yard 6 days, and what felt like an entire lifetime ago, that he had nothing left to say that wouldn't undersell it. So he said the only true thing available to him instead. "Come back," he said. "You don't have to wait 9 years to do it again." "I won't," Vesherin said. "Some debts, once they're paid, you don't let lapse back into distance just because the paying's done. That's not how a conquered keeps a promise, and it's not how I intend to keep this one." She stepped back toward the waiting shuttle, the bird at her throat catching the low morning light exactly the way it had caught it 9 years earlier through a ventilation slat, and looked back once more before she boarded. "Watch the boy learn the recitation, Elias. When he can say all our names in order without missing one, you'll understand exactly what you started on a siding, at 18, with half a ration bar and nothing else to give." That evening, Bramwell turned out along the depot fence line to watch the kindred's vow break orbit and go. A long, bright line climbing east across a sky gone gold and then gray, thinning to a star, and then to nothing at all. Eli stood in the same yard that had once held the worst night of his life, a new carved bird warm in his closed fist, and an old one already promised to return, with Milo on one side of him and Vray on the other already correcting the boy's grip on a moisture gauge, and understood, watching the light climb and vanish, that 9 years and 3 systems had finally, completely repaid a debt that had never once, in all that time, needed repaying to be worth what it cost him.